I'm Jason Lewis.
I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a group of concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways that each of us can make a difference. This is our first podcast of 2026. Our release schedule remains one episode per quarter for the near term. This allows us to invest more energy into local climate advocacy. For our listeners who live in our hometown of Portland, Oregon, and are interested in getting involved in climate action, go to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the contact button. Let us know that you want to get involved, and we'll reach out from there. There's no doubt that we need more local voices, and getting involved in engaging elected officials can be really effective and really rewarding.
Totally agree, Flora. I think, if folks haven't before, there's something really amazing about, being able to sit there with your elected representatives and, talk about a problem that matters to you. And, in this place where it can feel like we don't, have a lot of control, it's a great way to plug in and do something tangible. Well, when it comes to driving down carbon emissions, historically, most of the climate movement has really been focused on pushing elected officials to take policy action, right? Policy action has moved forward in many countries across the world. However, when we sort of step back and look, really only a fraction of the nations in the world are doing enough. And, in those cases where governments are, falling short of what's needed to protect their citizens from climate change, legal action can be a critical tool. So today, we're going to dig into the world of climate litigation and its importance in helping drive climate mitigation, adaptation, and of course, justice for all the communities who are suffering from the impacts of the crisis that, they didn't create. But before we get into all the legal stuff and today's guest, let's talk about this week's reason for hope.
Thanks, Jason. According to energy think tank Ember, a record 814 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity were installed globally in 2025, which is 20% more than 2024. And just to put that into perspective, that's enough clean energy capacity to meet all of Japan's electricity demands. And that's enough roughly to offset about 15% of the world's natural gas generation.
That's a crazy number. I mean, I think gigawatts are kind of, people probably their eyes roll back into their head, like, what are we talking about? But when you think about that, last year alone, the world built enough solar and wind to power all of Japan. That's pretty incredible.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other way to put it into perspective, like 1 gigawatt of electricity generation is typically the size of, say, 1 nuclear power plant reactor or 1 large coal-fired power station.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, right? That's roughly 1,000 power plants that we have offset with this clean energy.
Wow. Well, definitely a good reason for hope then, and nice to have it put into perspective. If we're feeling ready to get into the legal stuff, our guest this episode is Michelle Jonker-Argueta from Greenpeace International. Michelle oversees Greenpeace International strategic litigation work. She advises on the development and implementation of legal strategies to hold governments and corporations accountable for climate change, biodiversity loss, and resulting human rights violations. Prior to joining Greenpeace International, Michelle worked in international human rights, international criminal law, and asylum law. She's an attorney registered with the New York Bar. She holds her Juris Doctor from Yale Law School, and she's also a Dutch lawyer and is originally from Guatemala.
Michelle, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'd love to kick things off with something maybe starting a little lighter. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you feel hopeful?
Oof. So good question. I would say that for all of us, it may be a difficult time to find hope when you have multiple fast developing crises. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that hope is something that you have to choose and that you have to work on. People talk about hope as an act of resistance or an act of solidarity. And I absolutely agree with that. And I do think that as long as we can keep hope alive, then we can find the strength to act together and be able to make a difference. So there are a lot of places, I think, lately where I can find hope. And I think others in the climate movement can also find hope in these places. And the first one I would say is, in the courage and the strength of activists and individual plaintiffs in litigation, and then people on the front lines of climate change. They're really speaking up and showing what climate harm looks like. And I would say that I also find hope in the increasing favorable judgments from courts around the world. Because for me, for a long time, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, but I would say that climate change has been, for a long time, not just a social justice and a human rights crisis, but it has been a crisis of impunity and the rule of law.
Yeah.
Because we've known for a while what these harmful activities are, and we've known for a while who are the most responsible.
Totally.
And somehow these activities continue and, unfettered, and they increase exponentially. And how is it that that's allowed to happen, and that those most responsible are allowed to continue their activities and also do so with absolute impunity? So for a while, to me, that was a crisis of the rule of law. But with the increased favorable judgments, I see now that there is a lot of hope from the efforts of affected communities and civil society. There's a lot of progress through the judiciary. So that, makes me get up and go to work. And yes, that's where I find hope.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Good.
totally agree. Well, maybe let's start, Michelle, with kind of tell us a little bit about your team and what they do at Greenpeace.
Sure, yes. So at Greenpeace International, at the legal unit, we have lawyers that work solely on defense and lawyers that work on organizational issues. And then we have, we work under the our general counsel, Kristen Casper. And then we have the litigation team that I lead. And this is a group of 7 attorneys from different backgrounds. I myself am originally from Guatemala. We have lawyers from Colombia, Brazil, Canada, the US, different backgrounds and levels of expertise. But we all share a deep commitment and drive and belief in the power of law in achieving our organizational mission and helping communities and other Greenpeace organizations around the world and allies in designing litigation and deploying litigation in order to achieve systemic change. And so we give strategic and substantive law advice, and we work, in the intersection of climate change and human rights, and in the intersection of environmental harm and harm to humans as well, and biodiversity laws. And we file litigation against powerful corporations and states. And yeah, that's what we do. And again, it's exciting to be at the cutting edge of litigation, but it's also, of course, heartbreaking as well, and it's difficult. Anyone that works in human rights, I think, or in environmental rights and law, can tell you that it's a labor of love, but it's also you got to find the hope. So I'm going to be checking out you guys' weekly Reason to Hope as well.
Oh, goodness. I mean, that leads into one of the other things that we wanted to ask you, which is about some of the legal tools that are used to compel these big corporations, big government, to do more on climate change. Because, there have definitely been some recent cases where we've seen you guys making progress.
No, yes, there's been a lot of progress. I would say the last couple of years have been really exciting in terms of positive legal outcomes. We've had, communities, civil society members, allies, Greenpeace International, and the Greenpeace network, the network of Greenpeace organizations around the world. We've utilized different legal tools and pathways, but not in isolation, right? Part of a bigger advocacy, mobilization, and communication strategy in order to have that change that we want to see. And one of the really exciting changes or progress that I have seen is the contextualization of the law to the realities of climate change. And so you're seeing courts are now recognizing, right, that climate change is this global problem that is not the same as, let's say, a localized pollution problem.
Yeah.
So they're going to be looking at, it's a global problem with many sources, but there is an ability to find liability, find the responsibility of individual actors for either their acts or omissions. And when it comes to a global problem like climate change, many courts at the beginning were like, cannot compute. Like they couldn't really understand how to interpret the law in the face of these facts. And now with all this litigation that's been going on for 10, 15 years, you see now that courts are saying, actually, look at the science. We can easily use the law that we have and grant the relief that these communities are seeking. We can see the culpability. We can see the duties of states and other actors for failing to act or acting insufficiently. And when it comes to that duty of care that states have, there's been now these international courts have rendered advisory opinions on climate. And they've found that in the context of climate change, the duty is an enhanced due diligence or a stringent due diligence. So it's no longer enough to do bare minimum. There are very specific things that states have to do in order to discharge this duty. And it's been described as states must take all necessary measures or all means at their disposal to prevent climate harm. So these are really big advancements in the law that we've seen in the last couple of years that we hadn't seen before. Yeah.
Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think to Flora's point, like it seems like we're seeing more progress in that vein. Maybe wondering, can you tell us about sort of specific maybe examples? Like I know there was the recent Bonaire case.
No, there's been so many victories at the domestic level, very concrete examples that I can give you. And the Bonaire ruling here in the Netherlands the last couple of weeks has been groundbreaking and very exciting. The court in the Netherlands held that the Dutch state had violated the human rights of people from Bonaire. It had also engaged in discrimination because there was no objectively justifiable reason for the state to have not taken sufficient adaptation measures vis-a-vis the people of Bonaire, and also in general mitigation measures to combat climate change. And what's exciting about this is that when it comes to the discrimination angle, it's really important. I don't know if you know much about Bonaire, but it's a offshore territory of the Netherlands. Is supposed to be a special municipality. The people from Bonaire are also Dutch citizens. And there was really no reason why the state wasn't, making plans to adapt over there, but they were excellent plans over here for many years. And the court really acknowledged that. So for us, that was very exciting. And also exciting is that the court saw a lot of the defenses of the state, for what it was, insufficient, right? The state, tried to hide behind certain standards, for example, EU climate law. And the court basically said, actually, EU climate law is one thing. Yes, you should adhere to that, but you have to do even more. It's not enough to just hide behind, your minimum standards. You have duties under the European Convention of Human Rights to address climate change and do more.
Wow, this is so wonderful. I wrote my senior thesis in university on Bonaire and ecotourism and climate change. Yeah, and so I was so excited to come on and get to hear you talk about this. But it's just amazing, I think, to see that you can't talk about climate change, you can't talk about environmentalism without talking about human rights, and to see that intersectionality recognized at the legal level is just really important.
So, part of the litigation that we run, of course, is robust in its evidence and its arguments, but it's also meant to give a platform for those who haven't had a voice. And we had plaintiffs from Bonaire that were talking about their experience, not only in climate change, but also in the fact that, 40% of Bonaire lives under the poverty level.
Yes, yeah.
And that acknowledgement of that, they are in a especially vulnerable situation because of where the island is and their reliance on tourism and like you're saying, ecotourism, but also because there's been a lot of discrimination, racial discrimination of the people of Bonaire historically, right? And having this, there's this beautiful quote that I want to read to you from Jackie Bernabella, one of the plaintiffs, and this is in her testimony in the trial in The Hague, and she said that they will continue to speak the truth, not to divide, but to heal, not to accuse, but to be heard. And once the judgment came out, she was in the court and she was really excited that their voices had been heard, that they were no longer, in her words, being treated as second-class citizens. So that's kind of part of that intersectional approach to climate litigation. Yeah. So that was very exciting.
Oh my God. Yeah. What essential work, right? Like what a phenomenal thing to hear.
How much, not being in the legal sphere, how much sort of you're talking about kind of, this buildup where courts are starting to, understand, connect the dots, be able to say that, there are remedies. How much could, like a case in Bonaire impact something around the world? Is it, I guess it depends, I suppose, on like jurisdiction and so forth, but just interested in kind of like, are these things really layered on top of one another in terms of being able to leverage a success in one place, to another?
Absolutely. We are seeing, especially because Greenpeace, as a network of independent organizations, we're well positioned to see these different litigation projects playing out and working with local allies and regional allies as well. And we can see, we can say with confidence that a lot of courts are looking at each other to how other courts are resolving issues of causation and of standing, how they're looking at attribution science, how they are, allowing lived experience testimony in their courtrooms to support the scientific data, and ultimately how courts are deciding on different issues. And you'll see courts in completely different regions citing each other. We had even in the UK, right, that is not a member of the EU anymore. There was a case called the Finch case about Scope 3 emissions from combustion. Should these be part of an environmental impact assessment? And the court over there cited a case that we were running in Norway, where sure enough, the court said, yes, you should look at combustion emissions because right, you're going to be burning this fossil fuel. So it's not just about the local emissions in production, it's about what emissions will result ultimately from the inevitable combustion of these products. That's what you need to look at in an environmental impact assessment. And so the court in the UK, in the Supreme Court, cites a lower court in Norway, and that gets solidified. It's kind of like we're building together with allies and communities a international architecture of law and protection for people and planet. And I think that that's why you're seeing so much advancements in the law, because people are seeing what others are doing and citing comparative law as well.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah. You'd hope that was the case.
Well, I usually tell my son, like, mommy's job is very basic. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm asking basic stuff from the courts, like basic. Sometimes, you get a victory and you're like, yay, but how obvious was it, right? Like, do we really have to have a court say, yes, emissions from combustion should be taken into account when you're doing a environmental impact assessment for fossil fuel production?
Yeah.
Like, that's basic. Yeah.
Well, so kind of building on Flora's earlier question, are there, if we sort of look beyond governments to kind of holding fossil fuel companies accountable, what kinds of strategies, are being used?
I think as the law is getting stronger and the evidence is also getting stronger in cases against governments, the same thing is happening against corporate actors. This enhanced due diligence that you see for governments. I say states, but in the US, that probably sounds like I'm saying states. But yeah, so against state actors, let's say. If you see that, it has due diligence, part of that is to regulate corporate actors. So there's now a onus on the government which again, I would say is basic, right? You have to be able to apply the law to also private actors. And you have to do that with an enhanced due diligence. So that's a big entry point. But there is also a growing recognition in domestic courts and regional courts as well, of the independent duty of corporate actors to people for the climate crisis. And again, I will say, yes, duh. If you break it, you buy it. If you are doing all these emissions and you know about it and you lie about it and you continue to profit from it, how is it that you're escaping liability? Like,
Right.
but now now courts are like, yeah, actually corporate actors, those actually also should be held to account through the law. We had in the Netherlands, for instance, a big win against Shell, and then in the Court of Appeal, that gets reversed to a certain extent, because in law, in principle, yes, they have a absolute obligation, a duty, independent duty to do their part, but the court then couldn't really come up with a number of what reductions they had to do. So that case is going now to the Supreme Court, but the principle remains. There is an obligation for these corporate actors to do something about their activities that are harming the planet and also harming human rights.
You mentioned just like the classic playbook when organizations, companies are kind of trying to evade responsibility, evade justice. And I feel like that, brings us very nicely into talking a little bit about what SLAPP lawsuits are and what an anti-SLAPP lawsuit is.
Yes, I mean, at its core, a SLAPP suit, so a strategic litigation against public participation, call it SLAPP. A SLAPP suit is at its core an attempt to harass and intimidate. It's not a lawsuit that is filed for the purposes of seeking justice. It's an abusive process. It's seeking to intimidate people who speak up on a matter of public interest, and it's forcing those people who were speaking up in a matter of public interest, is forcing them to spend time and resources away from advocacy work or human rights work or defending the environment work, and spend that defending themselves. Now, the big challenge here is the power differential. So when you have these bullies using or abusing rather judicial processes to intimidate and to harass, you have to realize that a SLAPP suit is the starting point, is the huge power differential. And these people that are filing the SLAPP, they don't need to win ultimately. They just need to spend money, get the person to be choked up in legal paperwork, and not be able to continue their work.
Yeah. And in whatever capacity you're able to, we would love to hear more about potentially Greenpeace's experience.
Yes, of course. So, Greenpeace has been, Greenpeace International and the Greenpeace USA entities, Greenpeace Fund and Greenpeace Inc., were subject to a SLAPP suit in the United States by Energy Transfer. And this resulted in a very big jury verdict against the different entities. And so Greenpeace International here in the Netherlands, we are a Dutch established charity. Greenpeace International sued Energy Transfer here in Amsterdam, and under a anti-SLAPP law. And this is a EU-wide, a European Union-wide anti-SLAPP law that exists. And it was enacted, of course, because the European Union started seeing that more and more corporate bullies were starting to file these suits against civil society members, against individuals. And the suit here is like an anti-SLAPP suit. And this is a first case of its kind. And we're seeking basically compensation for the cost and reputational harm that has been suffered because of that SLAPP suit that was done in the United States.
So, as we're talking about all this, I'm wondering what sort of the experience of the plaintiffs is like and how these cases kind of come about. Mentioned earlier, like there was a case brought by youth in the state of Montana, the calling out the state for not accounting for, the impact of emissions and approving new stuff. But just wondering generally, like kind of how do these come about and what's that experience like for these plaintiffs that are involved?
Typically, we would start with talking to affected communities. And this is a process that, goes on for a long time. People want to be heard. People want to have a platform to talk about the issues that they care about and to have a chance to define the problem the way they see it, and to also discuss what kind of solution they would seek. In the conversations, when it emerges that litigation could be a potential avenue for change, that's when we get brought in, and then
Okay.
we start talking to the communities, and then we start working with local expert council, and we start seeing what the possibilities are. And one of the really cool, really meaningful, I think, experiences in the litigation journey is to work together to define what that vision of justice is. And then you start working with what are the possibilities under the law in order to achieve that, whether it's damages or whether it's, in a particular order from the court. What are their immediate concerns? What are their dreams for their future? So that, it's a whole process, a whole journey that we go through. And litigation is a powerful tool, but it's just a tool. It has to be, I think, accompanied by real hard work with the communities, because at the end of the day, we want to see that that community was left with more power now than they had before, and the ability to take charge of their own destiny that they didn't have that before.
How fascinating. It's just so much more, I think, collaborative than we give law credit for a lot of the time. And I mean, how intimate, right? To be growing alongside these people for so long. And yeah,
Yeah,
super
that's very
interesting.
true. That's very true. But I do have to say that, it's known by many names, right? But, the name that we use here is movement lawyering, the movement lawyering approach. And I'm constantly learning about it. And I'm constantly learning mostly from the Greenpeace organizations in the global majority, in global south. Like, they've been doing this for years and years. I mean, the Philippines Human Rights Commission investigation, if you know about it, it's, this big investigation into the culpability of the carbon majors, the big fossil fuel companies, for exacerbating climate change and lying, etc. And the commission found these corporate actors 47 liable, right? It said they could be held liable. So they found that the law does apply and that there are human rights obligations. And that litigation took about 7 years, but it was led by local communities and local actors, and they went after all the big corporate actors. And I think it was just really like all that effort really inspired a lot of what we do now in general with litigation all over the world. So it was the example, the leadership of others that, where we learned from, and we continue on.
Wow. I mean, yeah, just the more that I hear, the more that it's really clear that Greenpeace is doing just really, really essential work. And this is how we often wrap up these podcasts. And also a really genuine question, which is just for our listeners here, what can individuals do if we want to help with the legal action that's being taken to drive climate action and climate justice in general, or even more specifically for Greenpeace?
I think, yeah, I would love to speak in general, because again, we're just one actor in the whole ecosystem, and would love to have listeners be inspired and get involved in litigation run by whomever it is, in order to protect the planet and hopefully our human rights and the rights of future generations as well. And I think support for legal actions can happen in many different ways. It's not like, let's go and file a lawsuit tomorrow, but it's, you can, supporting inside the courtroom, but also outside the courtroom on the streets. It can take so many forms. I think the very, as we spoke at the beginning, I think the first one is the act of hope as an act of resistance and an act of solidarity. I think it's super important. And you can, in addition to that, keep informed. I think if people wanted to be even more involved in litigation, they could research which NGOs, civil society organizations, or community groups that are already working in climate cases. And yeah, there's different ways to get involved in different cases around the world, even if you don't have to even live in the same jurisdiction. We've been working, like I mentioned, a lot with lived experience testimony, and how important it is to have that lived experience evidence, not only for litigation, but also I think for policy. So if people, have, they can keep track of their own story, right? What they're seeing, the changes that they're seeing. I mean, I think all of us have seen changes in our lives, in our environment, but mostly people that are outdoors, that they can see and document all that. Citizen science can in the end be helping out also to spread the word, to have the kind of lived experience evidence that will later on be able to be used, to show the face of climate change.
Well, it sounds like lots of avenues to plug in. And to your point, like if people don't feel like, putting themselves on the front lines, there's still ways to contribute and to help. Well, Michelle, I just wanted to say huge thanks for coming on and talking with us, and for all the great work you and your team are doing. Definitely a source of inspiration and hope for us as well.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for you guys for all the work that you do. I'll continue listening to the podcast. I love it. And thanks for having me and letting me chat a little bit about what we do. So thanks a lot.
No, seconding the thank you. Sincerely, this has been really lovely. It's been a treat.
Well, as always, have amazing guests that join our podcast, and it was fascinating to learn about the legal side of things, even though I don't speak legalese. Yeah, I mean, what did you guys think? What were your takeaways from the discussion?
I'm with you. She left me with a ton to think about, but definitely one of the first things that I wanted to do was take a deeper look at some of the cases that she mentioned, just because I thought they were really interesting, particularly those that she kind of called movement lawyering, where people are working on these cases that extend for a long period of time with the same group of individuals, really trying to give a voice. The Philippines in particular has a really long history with taking on climate-causing giants in court. And that started as early in 2015 following a super typhoon, when civil society groups, typhoon survivors, and the Philippines Commission on Human Rights came together and created the Climate Change and Human Rights Inquiry, which was kind of the first of its kind to really investigate corporate responsibility for the climate crisis. And really interesting. And they specifically took a look at these giants, 47 of the largest fossil fuel and cement companies, from Chevron to ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, all these big names that we've heard of. And then from there, much more recently, in 2025, the survivors of Super Typhoon Odette have filed this case in the UK against Shell for its role in driving the climate crisis. It's a groundbreaking case for a couple of reasons. First, because it's just this massive climate-related personal injury and property damage case. Second, because it's the first of its size and scope to be brought against a fossil fuel company. And also because it's this first civil claim in the Global South that links oil and gas companies directly to death and personal injury due to climate change and its impacts.
Yeah, it seems like there's sort of this collaborative, whether directly collaborative or not, this collaborative effort, right, to figure out and lay the legal foundation to be able to, hold these corporate actors accountable. It's clearly having an impact. You see, some of the desperate moves here in the U.S. By fossil fuel companies trying to avoid accountability. They've tried 5 times in the last 3 years to stop climate lawsuits. They've been asking Congress for immunity from climate damages. And, in their latest attempt, there was a lawsuit filed a number of years ago by the city and county of Boulder, seeking funds to address climate impacts. Basically, Exxon and Suncor want to overturn the Colorado Supreme Court decision that says the case can move forward, and they want to sort of federalize it, where they think they'll have a more sympathetic audience. And, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear their appeal. This is the first time this has happened. So we'll definitely want to be making a lot of noise to make sure the court understands that, we need accountability. And in the absence of, congressional action, which has been rolled back in the U.S. in the last few years, if they're not going to regulate carbon emissions, people need a remedy.
I'm hoping that with this whole situation right now with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz being blocked, that it's coming home to people that we are very dependent on a very fragile supply chain of oil. I'm hoping this will longer term shift the opinions of those that are making the decisions in the legal realm that, well, maybe we should be taking that into account, because it's not just one or two things when people make a decision to overturn a case. Like, we take the situations in Australia where there were a bunch of school children that put a case against the federal government that they owed them a duty of care, and that got thrown out, right? And we've got another situation in Australia where the Torres Strait Islanders put a case against the government, and that too got rejected, and that it was the decision was made by the judiciary that they did not need to the government did not need to show a duty of care to these people. But those people are only a reflection. The people making the decisions are only a reflection of your society in general. So I am hoping with this situation where Australia is so dependent on foreign oil and the subsequent emissions that come from that, that this situation where we have 80 tankers of fuel a month coming to Australia, and now that is slowly grinding to a halt because of the situation in Iran, I am hoping that that will start to influence those decision makers, that, maybe there are a few things that we need to take into consideration that we'd not done in the past. And hopefully that will influence their decisions going forward.
Yeah, I do think there is obviously on the NGO side and the work that, Michelle and other teams like her team are doing are helping, educate these decision makers. I think it is helpful, maybe a silver lining in an otherwise terrible situation in Iran, that people, come to recognize and be reminded that, like, hey, there are all the climate consequences associated with burning, fossil fuels. And by the way, there are also all these other issues that come along with it, this baggage. To your point, Thomas, a handful of countries controlling, energy supply, and maybe this situation, for the Asian countries is sort of like, Ukraine was for Europe, and, helps motivate them to sort of double down on decarbonization.
And I think the point that she made during the interview that really stuck in my mind is so many of these fights just shouldn't have to happen. Like, the fact that we should even having to be proving that the government should show duty of care to people's islands not being flooded by climate change and global warming and sea level rise just blows my mind. It just seems so ridiculous.
100% I'm with you. Yeah, and we've I feel like been seeing this in the US too, where you've just got some of these almost absurdist moments where you're like, how can we possibly be talking about this in the courts? How did we regress this far? That's definitely been the case for me, at least, very recently, what with the repeal of the endangerment finding. Yeah, definitely one of those cases that you can't help but look at and just question how we got here. But in January, we had a federal judge who ruled that the Energy Department violated the law by gathering in secret to create a government report on global warming. This quote unquote climate working group that met was composed of 5 scientists who reject the current scientific consensus on climate change and the fact
handpicked. Yeah.
Yep, handpicked. So this, in the moment, the fact that it was occurring certainly didn't feel good, but the fact that it was getting challenged in the court and had in fact been ruled as a violation of the law felt like a win. But since then, that same climate working group and their results were actually used to justify the repeal of the endangerment finding, which was essentially our legal basis holding the EPA accountable for regulating emissions and pollutants.
Yeah, distressing to see. And obviously that has sparked, what will be a hugely watched climate lawsuit where you've got all these states and, NGOs like the Greenpeaces that are suing and saying, hey, you can't overturn this endangerment finding. Like, the evidence is clear that we've, carbon emissions are causing this problem, right? And that the EPA, has this obligation to reduce to regulate these things that are causing us harm. Well, with all this talk about, legal action and what's going on, some of you may be asking rightfully, like, well, hey, how can I get involved? Obviously, Michelle talked about that a little bit, but we have a couple suggestions, tangible suggestions for you. And I'll let Flora, Thomas, you guys tee those up.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the first she definitely spoke to, but I think the simplest and also one of the most effective is to support the organizations like Greenpeace that are leading the legal fights against negligent governments and corporations. And a couple that we recommend, obviously including Greenpeace, are the Environmental Defense Fund and the Union of Concerned Scientists, specifically because they're the organizations that brought that case that eventually ruled the secret gathering of quote unquote climate scientists illegal to court. So we think that they're, obviously doing really important work and could use the support. And there's two ways that you can support organizations like this. The first is just to sign up to receive, any notifications about opportunities to get involved, things that you can do to help out. And the second, of course, is to donate. Plenty of these organizations right now, especially those that are being faced with SLAPP cases, really could use the support.
Okay, so the other way of tackling this is to approach it from a lifestyle change perspective. And I think this whole situation with the high oil prices are a great opportunity for us to rethink how we do things. And so things such as, am I going to take that jet trip somewhere on my next holiday? Or maybe I should be holidaying locally. Or maybe buy an electric car. You've been sitting on the fence for years, and now's the time to do it. I think you'll notice by now there's probably lead times have extended for purchases of electric vehicles, but you may as well get your name on the list now. The other thing too, we've got to keep in mind that what typically happens with oil price rises, and in this situation where they've been blowing up a lot of each other's gas resources, that will eventually push up the electricity price. So make sure that your house is well insulated, that if you've been thinking about replacing that resistive element or gas furnace with a heat pump, now's probably the time to do it before electricity and gas prices go up later in the year. And then, of course, the other thing that you can do is install solar panels. Here in Australia, we still have an incentive for installing home batteries. Although the government has rolled that back, it still does exist and will continue to exist beyond May the 1st, despite what the media run around telling people. So anything you can do that can get you off consuming liquefied fossil fuels or natural gas is going to save you money and save the planet at the same time.
Yeah, great reminders, Thomas, and especially on the efficiency side, the cheapest energy or the lowest impact energy is the energy we don't consume. That's why, that home insulation is so important. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. And as, Flora pointed out early on, if you're looking to get involved to help drive climate action locally here in Portland, click the contact button on our website, climateoptimist.co, and shoot us a note.